The Federation likes to pretend its starships are just science vessels, places of curiosity, diplomacy, exploration. But that's never been the whole truth. Every hull you see on a Starfleet registry is also a political document. A manifesto written in duranium and warp plasma that says, "This is how we see ourselves, and this is what we're afraid of." And in the late 24th century, no ship said more about the Federation's fears than the Sovereign class. We don't meet it that way, of course. On screen, the Enterprise E arrives as the cool new movie ship. Sleek, fast, ready to punch a hole through a Borg cube. For a lot of fans, that's where the analysis stops. It's the badass upgraded Enterprise, the one that replaced the Flying Hotel. But if you look at when the ship was actually conceived in universe, and what was happening around it, a different story emerges. A very different one. Because the Sovereign wasn't born in the Dominion War, and it wasn't built as some last-minute reaction to the Borg. It took shape in the uneasy years before all of that, in the shadow of Wolf 359, in a quadrant that was technically at peace, but quietly arming itself for something everyone could feel coming, and no one wanted to name. The Dominion Cold War. Not the kind where you declare enemies and draw battle lines. The kind where every border incident becomes a test. Every alliance feels conditional. Every new ship design is a message. And the Sovereign class was a message Starfleet never wanted to say out loud. In this video, we're going to strip away the movie sheen and the nostalgia. We'll look at what the Sovereign class actually represents, where it came from, what fears and failures shaped it, why it never really was a Borg killer, and why Starfleet treated it less like a battleship and more like a political chess piece. And to understand why it ended up looking the way it does, we have to go back to the transition moment, the years when the galaxy stopped being a playground, and Starfleet realized its neighbors were arming up. The era when the Federation slid, almost accidentally, into a Cold War. By the mid-2360s, the Federation was telling itself a comforting story, that the Great Wars were behind them, that diplomacy had replaced conquest, that Starfleet's greatest challenge was deciding which strange new world to visit next. But reality was starting to disagree. In 2367, the Battle of Wolf 359 didn't just destroy 39 starships and kill over 11,000 people. It exposed something far more dangerous. Starfleet had fundamentally misread the galaxy it lived in. A single enemy vessel tore through the fleet with terrifying efficiency, and there was no clever diplomacy, no scientific insight, no heroic maneuver that could undo the damage. For the first time in generations, the Federation realized it could lose. Not symbolically, not philosophically, physically. And Wolf 359 didn't happen in isolation. 3 years earlier, the Romulan Star Empire had emerged from nearly half a century of silence. After the Tomed incident, the Romulans vanished behind the neutral zone, rebuilding in secret, while the Federation convinced itself the problem had gone away. When they returned in 2364, they did so with massive D'Deridex-class warbirds and a renewed appetite for influence. These weren't exploratory cruisers. They were intimidation platforms. The Romulans hadn't forgotten the balance of power. They'd been refining it. At the same time, the Klingon Empire was showing signs of internal fracture. Chancellor Kempek's assassination in 2367 triggered a succession crisis. That spiraled into civil war, with the Romulans backing the House of Duras and Starfleet quietly tipping the scales the other way. Gowron ultimately prevailed, but the lesson was clear. The Klingons were no longer a predictable partner, and stability in the quadrant was no longer something you could assume. To the Federation's south, the Cardassian border war had technically ended in 2367, but peace came at a cost. The armistice and treaty created the demilitarized zone, carving up worlds, abandoning Federation colonists, and calling it diplomacy. What followed wasn't peace, it was resentment. By 2370, those abandoned settlers would organize into the Maquis, a guerrilla movement attacking Cardassian targets and dragging Starfleet into a shadow conflict it officially pretended didn't exist. And then there was the Gamma Quadrant. At first, it was just rumors, traitors whispering about an empire that absorbed worlds rather than negotiate, warnings from species that spoke of a power that ruled through fear and absolute control. In 2370, those rumors became undeniable. When the Jem'Hadar destroyed the Galaxy-class USS Odyssey, not in a desperate battle, but as a deliberate demonstration, the message was blunt. Stay out or be subjugated. Meanwhile, covert operations multiplied. Romulan intelligence nearly framed the Federation for arming Klingon rebels. Starfleet's illegal phase cloak experiment was buried for years, until it almost sparked a diplomatic disaster. The Tal Shiar and the Obsidian Order launched a secret joint strike against the Dominion, and were annihilated for their arrogance. Espionage wasn't an aberration anymore. It was the background noise of the era. Individually, each one of these events could be explained away. Together, they formed a pattern Starfleet could no longer ignore. By 2365 to 2370, the Federation wasn't surrounded by enemies, but it wasn't surrounded by certainty either. Old rivals were rearming, allies were unstable, new powers were appearing with no interest in Federation ideals, and the Borg had proven, beyond any doubt, that technological superiority was not a permanent condition. This was not open war, but it wasn't peace either. It was a multipolar standoff, defined by deterrence, intimidation, intelligence failures, and the constant fear that one misstep could ignite something catastrophic. A Cold War in everything but name. Publicly, Starfleet still talked about exploration and diplomacy. Privately, its leadership understood something vital. Projecting weakness was no longer an option. The Federation needed to look calm, confident, and unshakable, even if it wasn't. And that is the environment the Sovereign class was born into. Not as a response to a single enemy, not as a weapon built for a war that had already begun, but as a flagship designed for a galaxy where everyone was watching everyone else, where no one wanted to fire first, and where being unprepared was no longer survivable. And to understand why Starfleet would abandon the flying cities of the Galaxy class and quietly pivot towards something leaner, faster, and far more dangerous, we have to look at the ship that came before the Sovereign. Because before Starfleet could build a Cold War flagship, it had to lose faith in the one it already had. The Galaxy class was never meant to fight a war. It was meant to end the idea of war entirely. When Starfleet launched the Galaxy program in the early 2360s, it was making a statement about the kind of civilization the Federation believed it had become. These ships weren't just explorers, they were communities. Floating cities with schools, families, concerts, arboretums, and observation lounges. They carried civilians because Starfleet genuinely believed the galaxy was safe enough to bring your children to work. The Enterprise D wasn't just a flagship, it was propaganda. A promise that the age of fear was over. And for a while, it worked. The Galaxy class excelled at diplomacy. It projected confidence without aggression. When a Galaxy class ship entered a system, it didn't feel like an invasion, it felt like an invitation. The Federation wasn't just exploring space, it was modeling a future it assumed everyone else would eventually want. But that assumption collapsed under pressure. The first cracks appeared, but they appeared quietly. In 2365, the USS Yamato was lost, not to enemy fire, but to a cascading systems failure caused by an alien computer virus. For a brief moment, Starfleet even feared a design flaw in the Galaxy class itself. While that fear proved unfounded, the optics mattered. One of Starfleet's most advanced ships had been wiped out without ever firing a shot. Then came Wolf 359. The Enterprise D survived that encounter only because it wasn't there. Instead, the Federation watched as its fleet, including some of the most advanced vessels they had, was torn apart by a single Borg cube. Worse, The Borg used Starfleet's own flagship captain as a weapon. Picard's assimilation didn't just lead to tactical losses. It turned the symbol of Federation enlightenment into the instrument of its worst defeat. The Galaxy class wasn't just outgunned, it was compromised. In the years that followed, the illusion continued to erode. The presence of families on frontline vessels, once seen as a sign of confidence, began to look reckless. Children had nearly died during multiple crises aboard the Enterprise D. Entire civilian populations were being carried into situations Starfleet could no longer control. Even the ship's sheer size became a liability. Too large to maneuver easily, too complex to repair quickly, too expensive to lose. And then, in 2371, the unthinkable happened. The Enterprise D was destroyed. Not by a fleet, not by a superweapon, but by an aging Klingon bird of prey exploiting a moment of vulnerability. It was a humiliating end for what had once been the Federation's proudest symbol. Suddenly, the flying city philosophy looked dangerously outdated. The idea that Starfleet could blend civilian life and frontline service without consequences had failed under real pressure. Inside Starfleet, the reckoning was unavoidable. The Galaxy class had been designed for a galaxy Starfleet wanted to live in, not the one it actually occupied. It assumed rational actors, predictable rivals, and conflicts that could always be talked down before shots were fired. But the late 24th century wasn't that galaxy anymore. Starfleet didn't stop believing in exploration. It stopped believing exploration could be done safely without strength. The failure of the Galaxy class wasn't that it was weak. It was that it was built on an assumption of permanent peace. When that assumption collapsed, so did the philosophy behind it. And Starfleet learned a harsh lesson. The next flagship would not be a city. It would not carry families. It would not pretend that danger was an anomaly. It would still represent the Federation's ideals, but those ideals would now be protected by armor, redundancy, and overwhelming force. The Galaxy class had been a statement of hope. What came next would be a statement of preparedness. And that shift, from optimism to caution, from comfort to capability, would reshape Starfleet's entire naval doctrine. Because before Starfleet could build a Cold War flagship, it had to accept that its most utopian experiment had failed. Starfleet didn't announce a doctrinal shift. There was no address from the Federation Council, no admission that the galaxy had become more dangerous, no declaration that the age of pure exploration was over. But if you look at the ships Starfleet began building in the late 2360s and early 2370s, the change is unmistakable. After Wolf 359, Starfleet quietly stopped asking, what kind of ship best represents who we are? And started asking, what kind of ship ensures we survive? The answer was deterrence. Not deterrence through threats or rhetoric. No, that's not Starfleet. But deterrence through visible capability. The idea that the right ship in the right place could prevent a war simply by existing. The first sign of this shift came in a vessel Starfleet was very careful about how it described, the Defiant class. Officially, the Defiant class was an escort, a defensive platform designed to protect more valuable assets. Its designation was deliberately modest. There were no public announcements calling it a warship, no language suggesting Starfleet had crossed a line. But inside Starfleet, everyone understood what the Defiant really was. It was a ship designed to fight. Built compact, massively overarmed, armored in ways Starfleet vessels never had been before, there were no families, no civilian spaces, no illusion of comfort. The Defiant was a warship that Starfleet refused to name as such. And that distinction, it matters. Because it reveals an institution in transition. One that knew the rules had changed but wasn't ready to admit it openly. The Federation still needed to believe in its ideals, even as it quietly prepared for a galaxy that no longer respected them. The Defiant broke the taboo. Once that line was crossed, even quietly, everything else followed. By the early 2370s, Starfleet shipyards were producing an entire generation of vessels that bore little resemblance to the Galaxy class. The Akira class with its torpedo-heavy design, the Steamrunner class with its compact, reinforced hull, the Norway and Sabre classes, fast, aggressive, optimized for fleet engagements. Even aging Excelsiors were refit with modern weapons and reinforced systems, transforming diplomatic relics into combat-capable ships. These designs shared a new philosophy: smaller crews, higher firepower density, faster construction and deployment, redundancy over comfort, survivability over symbolism. Starfleet hadn't abandoned exploration, but it had accepted that exploration now required teeth. This wasn't panic, it was calculation. The Federation had learned that weakness invited probing, and probing invited escalation. If peace was to be preserved, it had to look expensive to challenge. Strength had to be visible, but not declared. And this is where the Sovereign class truly enters the story. Contrary to popular belief, the Sovereign was not Starfleet's direct answer to the Borg. That role belonged to ships like the Defiant, fast, compact, and expendable if necessary. The Sovereign was designed alongside these vessels, not as their replacement, but as their counterpart. Where the Defiant was built to fight, the Sovereign was built to prevent fighting. Its purpose was not to rush into battle, but to arrive first, to be seen, to set the tone before the first shot was ever fired. This is classic Cold War logic. You don't deploy your most advanced platforms only after war breaks out. You place them where their presence reshapes the strategic environment. You make escalation costly before anyone commits to it. Starfleet's new fleet reflected that thinking perfectly. Escorts and cruisers would handle the grinding realities of war. The Sovereign would carry the flag, alone if necessary, projecting authority, confidence, and quiet menace. It was the ship you sent when you wanted everyone to understand that the Federation was paying attention. By the time the Dominion revealed itself as a full-scale threat, this doctrine was already in place. Starfleet had already accepted that peace required strength, and that strength had to be visible, even when it wasn't openly acknowledged. The Sovereign class was not built for a war already underway. It was built for the moment before war, when every power is watching, when fleets are mobilizing, when the wrong signal could tip the balance. In that tense space between diplomacy and destruction, Starfleet needed a ship that could stand alone and say, "We are still here, we are still strong, and we are no longer unprepared." That ship was the Sovereign. The Sovereign class was never meant to sneak into a war. It was meant to arrive first, alone, unmistakable, and impossible to ignore. But that visibility only worked because everyone knew what the ship could do. This is the balance at the heart of the Sovereign class. It was designed to signal strength, but that signal carried weight only because the Sovereign was fully capable of backing it up. This was not a hollow symbol, it was a flagship built with the expectation that, if deterrence failed, it would still be standing when the fight began. The Sovereign was not a bluff. Starfleet needed a vessel that could sit at the center of a crisis without escalating it, but also without being vulnerable. A ship that could carry diplomats, admirals, and heads of state into unstable regions while remaining completely capable of surviving a worst-case scenario. The Sovereign was built to fill that role, political first, but never politically fragile. Everything about the ship reflects this dual intent. On paper, the Sovereign class is not the largest ship Starfleet ever built. The Galaxy class exceeds it in total internal volume, a consequence of carrying families, civilian infrastructure, and entire communities through space. The Sovereign, by contrast, is longer, leaner, and far more densely packed with systems. That difference is philosophical. The Galaxy was larger because it carried a civilization. The Sovereign feels larger because it carries force. Its integrated hull, elongated nacelles, and narrow profile gives it a predatory presence. There's no excess volume, no space wasted on non-essential functions. Everything about the ship suggests speed, power, and readiness. This was a vessel built with the assumption that combat was not hypothetical, and its weapons were not subtle. The quantum torpedo launchers sit openly on the forward hull, not hidden, not minimized. Phaser arrays wrap the ship in near continuous coverage. These choices were deliberate. A sovereign entering a system does not need to threaten anyone verbally. Its silhouette does that work for it. This is Cold War logic applied to starship design. You don't hide your most capable platforms. You make sure everyone knows exactly what they're looking at. The Sovereign's armament was not decorative. It was among the most formidable Starfleet had ever fielded. This was proven, not theorized, when the Enterprise E went toe-to-toe with a Borg cube at Sector 001. The ship absorbed punishment, adapted, and survived, contributing directly to the cube's destruction. That encounter wasn't an anomaly. It was validation. The Sovereign could fight the galaxy's worst nightmare and live. That fact is what made the deterrence credible. But despite this capability, the Sovereign was not treated as expendable. In a Cold War environment, your most powerful assets are not spent casually. They are positioned carefully, preserved deliberately, and revealed selectively. The Sovereign class embodied that philosophy perfectly. Capable of devastating force, but deployed where force was most meaningful. This is why the Sovereign makes sense as the Enterprise. The Enterprise is not meant to be the first ship destroyed. It is meant to be the ship that still exists when the dust settles. The one that can fight and then immediately negotiate. The one that can win and still represent Federation ideals afterwards. The Sovereign class wasn't built to avoid combat. It was built so that when combat came, the Federation would not lose its voice or its flagship in the first exchange. And that, more than raw firepower, is what made it Starfleet's Cold War flagship.